Hi, welcome to Healing Tunes. Please watch the video. Today we are discussing the neuroanatomy part is the cerebrum. The cerebrum is the largest part of the human brain that fills most of the cranial cavity. Its large size is the result of progressive centralization of the various higher sensory and motor centers of the brain during evolution. The cerebrum is a heavily convoluted bilobed structure. The two lateral halves are called cerebral hemisphere. When the two cerebral hemispheres are viewed together from above, right central hemisphere, then left cerebral hemisphere, they assume the shape of an ovoid mass which is bordered behind than in front. The widest transverse diameter corresponds with a line connecting the two parietal tuberosities. A deep median cleft, the longitudinal cerebral fissure, is incompletely separate the two cerebral hemispheres. Both in front and behind the cleft is complete, but in the central part the cleft extend downwards up to the corpus callosum, which is a large mass of white fibers joining two cerebral hemispheres across the median plane. The longitudinal cerebral hemifissure is occupied by the following structures: Fox cerebri, fold of arachnoid that follows the surface of the fox cerebri. Pia matter covering the medial surface of the fox cerebri. Anterior cerebral arteries and veins. Each cerebral hemisphere consists of an outer layer of gray matter called cerebral cortex, an inner mass of white matter. Then third is the large masses of gray matter embedded in the basal part of the white matter called basal ganglia or basal nuclei. Then fourth part is the a cavity within it is called lateral ventricle. Then external features of the cerebral hemispheres. The external features of cerebral hemisphere include poles, surfaces, borders, sulci, and gyri. First one is the poles. Each cerebral hemisphere present three poles: frontal pole, occipital pole, and temporal pole. The anterior end of hemisphere is the frontal pole and the posterior end of occipital pole, the temporal pole, is below and in front at the junction of orbital and temporal surface. The frontal pole at the anterior end of the hemisphere is more rounded than occipital pole. It lies opposite the medial part of the superciliary arch. Next is the occipital pole. The occipital pole at the posterior end of the hemisphere is more pointed than the frontal pole. It lies at a short distance superlateral to the external occipital protuberance. Next is the temporal pole. The temporal pole between frontal and occipital poles points forwards. It fits into the anterior part of the middle cranial fossa and is overhung by the lesser wing of the sphenoid. Next is the surfaces. Each cerebral hemisphere has three surfaces: superlateral surface, medial surface, and inferior surface. The superlateral surface is most convex and most extensive. It faces upwards and laterally and conform to corresponding half of the cranial vault. See the surface, red arrow mark start from the higher point and lower point. This is the superlateral surface. Next is the medial surface. Medial surface is flat and vertical. It presents a thick C-shaped cut surface of the corpus callosum. See the picture, left side red arrow mark is the medial surface. Next is the inferior surface. Inferior surface is irregular to adopt the floors of anterior and middle cranial fossa. It is divided into two parts by a deep horizontal groove or sulcus. Next is the borders. Each cerebral hemisphere presents six borders, that is supermedial border, superciliary border, infralateral border, medial orbital border, inframedial border, medial occipital border. First is the supermedial border. Separate the superlateral surface from the medial surface. Second is the inframedial or hippocampal border. Surround the cerebral peduncle. It is formed by the medial aspect of uh, uncus and parahippocampal gyrus. Parahippocampal gyrus. Third border is the infralateral border. Separates the superlateral surface from the tendorial surface. Posteriorly, this border exhibits a notch, the perioccipital notch, about 3 cm in front of the occipital pole. This notch is used as useful surface landmark. Next is the superciliary border. It is at the junction of superlateral and orbital surface. It lies just behind the superciliary arch, hence its name strictly speaking. It is the orbital part of the infralateral border. Next is the medial orbital border. Separates the medial surface from the orbital surface. Next is the medial occipital border. It separates the medial surface from the tentorial surface. Next is the sulci and gyri. The cerebral cortex, the surface layer of gray matter, is highly extensive in man. To accommodate it in the limited space available within the rigid cranial cavity, the surface of cerebral hemisphere becomes folded, producing numerous convolutions separated by fissures. These convolutions and fissures are termed gyri and sulci respectively. In human brain, the total surface area of the cerebral hemisphere is about 2000 centimeters square, but approximately two-thirds of this is hidden from the surface view within the wall of sulci. The sulci is vary in depth from slight grooves to deep fissures, and some of them are sufficiently deep to indent the wall of lateral ventricle in the depth of hemisphere. The gyri consist of a central core of white matter, that is nerve fiber running to and fro the overlying convex cortex, covered by a layer of gray matter, the cerebral cortex. There is a great deal of individual variations in the detail of sulci and gyri. Therefore, following account deals with only some important sulci and gyrus. That sulci, lateral sulcus, central sulcus, calcarein sulcus, and parieto-occipital sulcus. First is the lateral sulcus. Lateral sulcus is the most conspicuous of all the cerebral sulci and has a stem and three rami. The stem of the sulcus begins as a deep cleft on inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere at the anterior perforated substance and extends laterally between the temporal pole and the posterior part of the orbital surface of the hemisphere. Next sulcus is the central sulcus. Central sulcus begins by cutting the supromedial border of the hemisphere about 1 centimeter behind the midpoint between the frontal and occipital poles. Next is the calcarein sulcus. This is present on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It begins as a deep fissure a little below the posterior end of the corpus callosum, the splenium, and follows an arched course with a convexity upwards to the occipital pole and may extend slightly onto the supralateral surface. Next sulcus is the parieto-occipital sulcus. Parieto-occipital sulcus is present on the medial surface of hemisphere. It begins at the midpoint of the calcarein sulcus and courses upwards and slightly backwards to cut the supromedial border of the hemisphere about 5 centimeter in front of the occipital pole and may extend slightly onto the superlateral surface. Sulci and gyri on the superlateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. First is in the frontal lobe. The prefrontal sulcus, often broken into two or three parts, run downwards and forwards parallel and little anterior to the central sulcus. The area between the central and precentral sulci is called precentral gyrus. Next is the anterior to the precentral sulcus. There are two sulci called superior and inferior frontal sulci which run horizontally. These sulci divided the region of frontal lobe is front of precentral sulcus into superior, middle and inferior frontal gyri. Third one is the anterior and ascending rami of lateral sulcus. Divide the inferior frontal gyrus into the three parts. The part below the anterior ramus is called pars orbitalis. The part between the anterior and ascending rami, the pars triangularis, and the part posterior to the ascending ramus, the pars opercularis. Next is the in the parietal lobe. The post-central sulcus run downwards and forwards, it little behind the parallel to the central sulcus. The area between these two sulci is called post-central gyrus. Next is the rest of parietal lobe is divided into superior and inferior parietal lobules by an intraparietal sulcus, which runs horizontally backwards from the post-central sulcus. Next is the lateral sulcus. The unturned posterior end of posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and the posterior end of superior and inferior temporal sulci extend into the inferior parietal lobule to divide into three parts. First one is the supramarginal gyrus, second is the angular gyrus, then arcus temporo-occipitalis. Next in the temporal lobe, there are two sulci in this lobe that run parallel to the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. These are termed superior and inferior temporal sulci and divide the temporal lobe into superior, middle and inferior temporal gyri. The superior surface of superior temporal gyrus present two transverse temporal gyri. The anterior transverse temporal gyrus, also called Heschl's gyrus, Heschl's HESCHLS gyrus, forms the primary auditory area of the cortex. Next is in the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe possesses three rather short sulci and lateral and transverse occipital sulci and lunate sulcus. Lateral occipital sulcus runs horizontally and divided this lobe into posterior and inferior occipital gyri. Lunate sulcus is C-shaped sulcus with forward convexity just in front of the occipital pole. Transverse occipital sulcus run downwards into the uppermost part of the occipital lobe from the supromedial border of hemisphere, a little behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. Next is the sulci and gyri on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. And the first one is the cingulate sulcus. It is the most prominent sulcus which follows a curved course about 1 centimeter above and parallel to the upper convex margin of the corpus callosum. Anteriorly, it ends below the genu of corpus callosum. Posteriorly, in the runs upwards to each reach the supromedial border of hemisphere, a little behind the upper end of central sulcus. For next is the callosal sulcus. It separates the cingulate gyrus from the corpus callosum. Then cingulate gyrus. Next is the sulci and gyri on inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. First one is the olfactory sulcus. It is a straight sulcus which run anteroposteriorly close to the medial border of the orbital surface. It is called olfactory sulcus because it lodges the olfactory bulb and tract. Orbital sulcus. It is an irregular H-shaped sulcus and divided the rest of orbital surface into anterior, posterior, medial and lateral orbital gyri. Next is the collateral sulcus. The tentorial surface is marked by two major sulci that run anteroposteriorly. The medial one is called collateral sulcus and the lateral one the occipito-temporal sulcus. The lateral is continuous around the infralateral margin with the inferior temporal gyrus. Then next is the posterior collateral sulcus. Then parahippocampal gyrus, rhinal sulcus and uncus, occipito-temporal sulcus, medio-occipito-temporal gyrus. The area between the occipito-temporal sulcus laterally and collateral and rhinal sulci medially is known as medial occipito-temporal gyrus. Next is the lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. To discuss further about SULCI and GYRI, the other aspect of the central hemisphere, the superlateral surface of the hemisphere is arbitrarily divided into four lobes: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. With the help of three main sulci, central sulci, lateral sulci, and parieto-occipital sulci, and two imaginary lines. The first imaginary line is a vertical line vertical line joining the parieto-occipital sulcus to the pre-occipital notch, and the second line is a backward continuation of the horizontal part of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus till it joins the first line. The frontal lobe lies anterior to the central sulcus and above the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. The parietal lobe lies behind the central sulcus and in front of the upper part of the first imaginary line. Below it is bounded by the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus and the secondary imaginary line. Third is the temporal lobe is lies below the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus and second imaginary line. It is separated from the occipital lobe by the lower part of the first imaginary line. Last one is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe lies behind the vertical line joining the parieto-occipital sulcus and pre-occipital notch. Next is the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the surface layer of gray matter covering the cerebral hemisphere. The cortex represents the highest degree of evolutionary development of the human brain, both in its relative size to other parts of the brain and its range of functions. It is principally responsible for three basic brain functions: perception, adaptation, responses, and movement, which are common in all animals or human. In general, each cerebral hemisphere control the opposite half of the body. That is, it sends motor commands to and receive sensory information from the contralateral half of the body. The cortex is highly folded into intricate convexities and grooves to increase its surface area in order to accommodate the large volume of gray matter in the limited space within the cranium, which provides for the wide range of mental activities. The cerebral cortex mainly divided into three: archicortex, paleocortex, and neocortex. Archicortex, phylogenetically, it is the oldest and constitutes the sizable portion of cerebrum of lower vertebrates. Paleocortex is the intermediate in development, and in man it is represented by the cingulate gyrus. Neocortex is most recent in development, and in man it is comprises about 90 percentage of the total area of the cerebral cortex. Structurally, it is thick and consists of six layers. Next is the structure of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex mainly consists of nerve cells, synapses, and neurologia. The human cerebral cortex contains enormous numbers, about 14,000 millions of neurons. The following five most type of neurons present in the cerebral cortex, that is pyramidal cells, satellite granular cells, horizontal cells, cell of Martinotti, and fusiform cells. First one is the pyramidal cells, are pyramidal in shape with their apices directed towards the surface. The axon arises from the base of the cell body, while dendrites arises from its apex and basal angles. The axon enter the white matter as projection fibers. Next is the satellite cells, are much smaller than pyramidal cells, and their cell bodies measure about 8 nanometer in diameter. They have star-shaped body with short axons and many dendrites. Next is the fusiform cells, have fusiform cells body with their long axis begin vertical to the surface. They are concentrated in the deepest cortical layer. Next is the horizontal cells of Kagel. Are fusiform and oriented horizontally. They are found in the most superficial layer of the cortex. Next is the cells of Martinotti, are small multipolar cells that are present throughout the layer of cerebral cortex. The cortical neurons connect with other neurons in following three ways. First one is the projection neuron. Transmit impulses to the subcortical centers, that is corpus, striatum, thalamus, brainstem, or spinal cord. Next is the association neurons. Establish connections with the cortical nerve cells elsewhere in the same cerebral hemisphere. Third one is the commissural neurons. Proceed to the cortex of the opposite cerebral hemisphere and established connections between the cortical nerve cells of the cerebral hemispheres. Next is the layers of cerebral cortex. The neocortex consists of six layers and laminae. From superficial to deep, these are as follows. First one is the molecular layer or plexiform layer, is made up of predominantly of nerve fibers and few scattered horizontal cells of Kagel. Second is the external granular layer is made up of mainly of densely packed satellite cells. Third one is the external pyramidal layer is made up of small and medium sized pyramidal cells. The sizes of cells increase from superficial to deeper border of the layer. Fourth one is the internal granular layer is made up of closely packed satellite cells. In the middle of this layer, there is a band of horizontally arranged white fibers called white styra or external band of Bellinger. Fifth one is the internal pyramidal layer is made up of mainly of large pyramidal cells. The basal part of the layer contains a thin band of horizontally arranged fibers called inner band of Beilanger. Last one is the multiform layer cells. Is made up of cells of multiple forms, that is neurons of various sizes and shapes. This layer fuses with the white matter. This layer also called layer of polymorphic cells. These are the layers of the cerebral cortex. Once again, review the layers. Molecular layer or flexiform layer. Second is the external granular layer. Third one is external pyramidal layer. Fourth one is internal granular layer. Then fifth one is internal pyramidal layer. And last one is multiform layer or layer of polymorphic cells. Next, functionally areas of cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is demarcated into large number of areas which differ from each other in structure as well as in function. Brodmann had in 1909 he had divided the cerebral cortex into 47 each areas and indicated each of them by a number. Types of cortical areas. According to the classical teaching, the cerebral cortex possesses three types of functional areas: motor area, sensory area, and association areas. Motor areas are primarily concerned with the motor functions and give origin to the projection fibers which form corticospinal and corticonuclear tracts. Next is the sensory areas are primarily concerned with the sensory functions and receive afferent fibers from the thalamic nuclei in which major sensory pathways terminates. Next is the association areas. These are not concerned with primary motor or sensory functions but have more important associative, integrative, and cognitive functions. Then, functional areas in the frontal lobe. First one is the primary motor area, that is the area 4 of Brodmann. Primary motor area is located in the precentral gyrus on the superolateral surface and extends to the anterior part of the paracentral lobule on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. It contains large number of pyramidal cells, including large pyramidal cells. About 40% of pyramidal fibers arise from this area. The electrical stimulation of primary motor area produces contraction of muscles of opposite half of the body. That is, it controls voluntary motor activities of the opposite half of the body. Although the cortical control of musculature of the body is mainly contralateral, there is significant bilateral control of the muscles of upper part of the face, tongue, mandible, larynx, pharynx, and axial musculature. Specific regions within the area of are responsible for movements in the specific part of the body. Only movements are represented in this area and not the muscles. The human body is represented in an upside downward manner in the precentral gyrus. The pharyngeal region and tongue are represented in the lowermost part, followed by face, hand, trunk, and thigh. The legs, feet, and perineum are represented on the medial surface of the hemisphere in the paracentral lobule. Further, there is disproportionate registration of the individual parts. The area of cortex controlling a particular movement is proportional to the skill involved in performing that movement and not to the bulk of muscle participating in the movements. Thus, face, especially the lips, tongue, larynx, hand, have an disproportionately large areas while the trunk and lower limb has small areas. You can see the picture and get the more idea about these points. Next is the premotor area. That is the area of 6. Premotor area is located anterior to the primary motor area in the posterior part of superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri and extend onto the medial surface of hemisphere. Premotor area is wider above than below, lacks the giant pyramidal cells. The premotor area is responsible for successful performance of voluntary motor activities. In fact, the primary motor area receives numerous inputs from the sensory cortex, the thalamus, and basal ganglia. It stores the programs of motor activity assembled as a result of past experience. The premotor area thus appears to be responsible for programming the extended movements of the primary motor area and controlling the movement in progress. Next is the supplementary motor area. Supplementary motor area is located in the medial frontal gyrus on the medial surface of hemisphere anterior to the paracentral lobule. The stimulation of supplementary motor area produces complex movements. Some are described as assumption of posture with bilateral effects, including turning the head, assuming positions of trunk and lower limb, etc. Next is the frontal eye field, that is the area 8. The frontal eye field is located in the posterior part of the middle frontal gyrus, just anterior to the facial area of precentral gyrus. The electrical stimulation of this region causes deviation of both the eyes, especially to the opposite side. The frontal eye field controls the voluntary scanning movements of the eyes and is independent of the visual stimuli. The frontal eye field is connected to the visual area of occipital cortex by association fibers. Next is the motor speech area of Broca's, that is Broca's area of 44 and 45. The motor speech area of Broca's is located in pars triangularis, area 45, and pars opercularis, area 44, of inferior frontal gyrus of frontal lobe of left hemisphere in most of the individuals, and the persons are right-handed. In 30% cases, it is present in the right hemisphere and person are left-handed. Broca's area is responsible for the production of expressive speech or vocalization. It brings about the formation of words by its connection with the adjacent primary motor area, which in turn approximately stimulate the muscles of speaking apparatus consisting of the lips, mouth, tongue, soft palate, larynx, and the respiratory muscles. Next is the prefrontal area. The part of the frontal lobe rostral of to the motor and premotor area is referred to as prefrontal area. This area is concerned with the individual's personality. It exerts its influence in terminating the initiative and judgment of an individual. It is also concerned with depth of emotions, social, moral, and ethical awareness, concentration, orientation, and foresightness. It is an area of cerebral cortex that is capable of associating experiences that are necessary for the production of abstract ideas. Next is the parietal lobe area, primary sensory area. That is the area of 1, 3, and 2. In the picture marked in the yellow area. 1 area of 3, 1, and 2. Primary sensory area is located in the post-central gyrus and extend into the posterior part of the paracentral lobule on the medial surface of the hemisphere. The opposite half of the body is represented upside down exactly in the same fashion as the primary motor area. Similarly, the area of cortex assigned for the particular part is not proportional to the size of that part but it is functional significance. Thus, the thumb, fingers, lips, tongue have a disproportionately large representation. The primary sensory area is concerned with the perception of extraceptive, that is, pain, touch, and temperature, and proprioceptive, that is, vibration, muscle, and joint sense. Sensation from the opposite half of the body. However, sensation from pharynx, larynx, and perineum go to both sides. The primary sensory area receives projection fibers from ventral posterolateral and ventral posteromedial nuclei of thalamus. Secondary sensory area is located in the upper lip of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. The face area lies most anterior and leg area is posterior. The whole body is represented bilaterally. This area related more the pain perception. Then next is the sensory association area. Sensory association area occupies the superior parietal lobule corresponding to the area 5 and 7. It is concerned with the perception of shape, size, roughness, and texture of the objects. Thus, it enables the individual to recognize the objects placed in his or her hand without seeing, such as ability to refer to as stereognosis. Next is the sensory speech area of Wernicke. That is the area 40 and 39. Sensory speech area is located in the left dominant hemisphere, occupying the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus of the temporal lobe and angular, that is area 39, and supramarginal, area 40, gyri of inferior parietal lobule. Wernicke's area is concerned with the interpretation of language through visual and auditory input. It is also an essential zone for constant availability of the learned words pattern. That is, Wernicke's area help us to understanding the speech and using correct words to express our thoughts. The angular and supramarginal gyri are essential for the process of learning, such as reading, writing, and computing. The lesion of this area produce wide variety of aphasic disorder like disabilities in reading, alexia, writing, agaphia, and computing, acalculia, and recognition of names of the objects, anomia. Then lesions involving both Broca's area and Wernicke's area, speech areas, result in loss of production of speech as well as loss of understanding of spoken and written speech. This condition is called global aphasia. Just we can compare comparison between the motor and sensory aphasia. If motor aphasia or Broca's aphasia is happen, that the area is 45 and 44. Then speech, effortful, dysarthric, telegraphic, and non-fluent. Comprehension speech is good, but ability to read, write, and calculate are also intact. Word blindness is absent. But in sensory aphasia or vernix aphasia is happen. Site of the lesion is area 22, 39, and 40. That is posterior part of the superior terminal gyrus and adjoining part of the superior parietal lobule. Speech is fluent, but comprehension of speech is poor. Ability to read, write, and calculate is lost or absent. Word blindness is present. Then next area is the primary auditory area. That is the area 41 and 42. The primary auditory area is located in the inferior wall of the lateral sulcus, and to be very specific, on the superior surface of the superior temporal gyrus, occupying the anterior transverse temporal gyrus, and extends slightly to the adjacent part of the superior temporal gyrus. The primary auditory area receives input from the medial geniculate body through auditory radiations. The medial geniculate body receives input from organ of corti in the cochlea of inner ear of both the sides, but mainly from the opposite side. This area is concerned with the reception of isolated impression of loudness, quality, and pitch of the sound. In addition, it also picks up the source of sound. Next is the secondary auditory area or auditory association area. That is the area of 22. Secondary auditory area is situated on the lateral surface of superior temporal gyrus, slightly posterior to the primary auditory area, which it surrounds. It receives auditory impulses from primary auditory area and correlates them with the past auditory experience. Thus, this area is necessary for the interpretation of the sound heard. Next is the primary visual area or striate area. That is the area 17. Primary visual area is situated in the walls and floor of the posterior part of the calcarean sulcus and may extend around the occipital pole onto the supralateral surface of the hemisphere. Most marked structural features of the visual cortex is the presence of white striate, visual stria of Jannari. Hence the name striate area. The visual cortex is relatively thin and contains huge amount of granule cells. The visual cortex receives afferent fibers from the lateral geniculate body via geniculocalcarine tract or optic radiations. The visual cortex receives fibers from temporal half of the ipsilateral retina and nasal half of the corticolateral retina. Thus, right half of the field of vision is represented in the visual cortex of the left cerebral hemisphere and vice versa. It is also important to note that impulses from the superior retinal quadrants pass to the superior wall of the calcarine sulcus, while the inferior retinal quadrants pass in the inferior wall of calcarine sulcus. Next is the secondary visual area or visual association area, the area of 19 and 18. The secondary visual area surrounds the primary visual area and occupies most of the remaining visual cortex on medial and superolateral surface of cerebral hemisphere. This area receives afferent fibers from primary visual area. It relates the visual information receives from primary visual area to the past visual experiences, thus enabling the individual to recognize and appropriate what he is seeing. In other words, the secondary visual area is responsible for recognition of the object scenes. Then other functional areas in the cerebral cortex, one is the taste area, gustatory area, is located in the inferior part of the parietal lobe, posterior to the general sensory area for the mouth, or in the lower end of the post-central gyrus, in the superior wall of the lateral sulcus, or in the adjoining area of the insula. That is the area 43. Next is the vestibular area, is probably located near the part of the post-central gyrus which is concerned with the sensation of face. Next is the olfactory area, that is the area 28, is located in the anterior part of the parahippocamal gyrus and uncus. The lesion of this area leads to olfactory hallucination. Then next is the paracentral lobule. This cortical area is located on the medial surface of cerebral hemisphere above cingulate gyrus between medial frontal gyrus infant and precuneus behind. Next is the central hemispheric dominance. In spite of an apparent congruity in size, shape, and features of the left and right cerebral hemispheres, they are not mirror images as far as certain neurological activities are concerned. There are certain established functional differences between the two hemispheres. Certain brain functions are lateralized. Each hemisphere has its own contributions. None is more important than other. The left hemisphere is more efficient as far as headness, perception of language, speech, writing, and calculation, numerical skills, are concerned. The right hemisphere is more efficient with spatial perception, geometrical and spatial relationships, recognition of faces, creative acts of art and music, and non-verbal identification. The term dominant hemisphere refers to the side concerned with the perception and production of language or speech. According to this concept, the left hemisphere is dominant in overall 90% of people, in whom the right hemisphere is described as a minor or non-dominant hemisphere. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, including the skillful right hand. Consequently, over 90% of the adult population is right handed. During childhood, one hemisphere slowly comes to the dominate over the other, and it is only after the first decade that dominance become fixed. That's all about the cerebrum and cerebral cortex, and the structure and function and functional areas. Next class, we will discussing about the white matter of the cerebrum and lateral ventricle. Please subscribe the channel, like the video, and share it. Thank you for watching our channel.